So today we're starting off a series within a series, meaning that for this video and the next two videos after that, we're going to be focusing on the positions after pawn to e4 is met by pawn to e5. And this is as part of our larger win with one e4 series. The reason why I wanted to dedicate 3 videos to this is because this is one of the most popular and correct ways of meeting e4 from the black side. So in one video, it was just not possible to even scrape the surface of what there is to know in these positions. The way that I'm going to be breaking it down is I'm going to be recommending after e4, e5 that we play our knight out to f3, knight to c6, and that we go for the popular so-called Italian variation. The bishop goes to c4. It's a very nice diagonal here and creates problems for black along f7 in many situations. And in this video, what I'm going to talk to you guys about is what we do after the move bishop to c5. Specifically, after bishop c5, I'm going to recommend the aggressive Deutz Gambit. We castle kingside, and when black develops their knight, we play the move pawn to d4. And this video is going to be dedicated to one of the sort of major responses that black has, the one that is seen at the professional level, and that is bishop takes pawn. However, another major response that black can go for is pawn takes pawn, and this is more commonly seen at the amateur, the non-professional level. So because of these two variations being very, very important, but leading down different paths, I decided that I would break it up into 2 videos, and today we'll talk about bishop takes d4. Now, you might be thinking, well, you mentioned that there would be 3 videos, so what's the 3rd video going to be about? Well, instead of bishop to c5, the other very popular move here that black can sometimes go for is knight to f6. And this does change things a little bit for us because in this position here, I'm recommending that we castle, but against knight f6, we have to be careful because of the fact that our pawn on e4 is under fire. So we have to change up our plans a little bit. So this will be the topic for the 3rd video. But for today, let's talk about the Deutz Gambit, the so-called Deutz Gambit, and why it is that I'm recommending it. So after bishop to c5, we go castle, and after knight f6, if you want a quiet game, you can just play a move like pawn to d3 here. And that is how the majority of games play out. But if you want something a little bit more aggressive that has been played at the very highest levels, more recently, one player who has had fantastic results with it is the Uzbek prodigy Abdusaturov. And Abdusaturov has played it against Caruana, Grishuk, Nakamura, and what's more, he's actually beaten all of these players. Not necessarily out of the opening, but it just goes to show that the opening is a playable opening system at any level. So that's the first thing. It's a sound way to play, but it also makes the players, the black side, it gives them a lot of choice, and it makes it very easy for them to go wrong if they don't know what they're doing. So for starters, we immediately force black to consider between 3 options. I'm not going to look at pawn takes d4, it's playable, but I'm not going to look at it here because that's the topic for video number 2. But before we talk about bishop takes, I want to show you knight takes pawn, and that this is already pretty much a losing position, or very close to it, because we grab this pawn on e5 that is no longer defended, and we hit the pawn on f7. And ask yourself, pause the video if you wish, and ask yourself, what would I do here from the black side? And many people will, in my opinion, come out with two answers. So you can pause and think about it if you want. I will even flip the board for you. And you can try and think about this position. What would you do if you suddenly are forced to come up with an answer, which is more or less what is happening here. So I will now flip the board back, and I will show what I think is very common. The first move that I think a lot of players will go for is d5. So maybe this is the move you considered, saying, now I cut off the attack on f7, but this loses after pawn takes d5. You're now down a pawn. If, let's say, you castle, the problem here is bishop to e3, and this, not only are you down a pawn, but this knight is sort of corralled and very difficult to rescue it. So that loses. If, on the other hand, you are thinking maybe to play knight takes d5, now we go c3, we target the knight, and if the knight moves, then we take this knight on d5. So this is also a losing position. If you didn't think of d5, perhaps you considered the move castle. And again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is also losing, because after bishop to e3, we target their knight. Where do you go with this knight? You know, if you go somewhere like here, I'll just chop. You know, then you take me, and then I'll take this bishop for free. So one natural option would be knight e6, where black hopes to defend everything. But the problem is that after I take this knight on e6, now the bishop is undefended. So if you take me, I will take you. And if you take me here, I have a nice intermediate move. Bishop takes f7 check. And the problem is you can take my bishop, but I will take your rook. And after you take my knight, I will take your bishop. So in the end, you can see that in this position, white has an extra rook versus black's bishop. And, you know, it's much better to have a rook because it's more valuable, but especially to have a rook that is as good as R1 and a bishop that is as bad as black's. So this position is, once again, losing for black. So this is the first kind of big trap that we set, and we hope that black will take us with the knight. But what happens if they don't and they take us with the bishop? Well, we're now down a pawn, and the question is, what do we have to show for it? Well, the first thing that we have to show for it is we grab their bishop here, so we now have what's called the bishop pair. Black shouldn't take with the knight, take the knight with the pawn, and the reason for this is it would allow us to push this pawn. And again, it's very uncomfortable for black, because if they ever take this pawn, their king is still in the center of the board, and we would go rook e1, and suddenly there are problems with f4. And so this brings up another benefit of playing the way we did. We open up the position, we open up lines, and we do so while our king is in the center of the board, while our king is castled, while theirs is in the center of the board. So after knight f6, d4, black should go bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and now knight takes d4. So what is our follow-up? Our follow-up is, and I actually really love this line, our follow-up is the move bishop to g5. And we have this annoying pin against the knight. And our idea is that we're going to follow this up eventually with the move pawn to f4, and we're going to put pressure in the center, and we're going to put pressure on this knight on f6. It's very uncomfortable, for example, for black to now castle, because we're going to go f4, and suddenly that rook and that bishop on this horrible pin will give us a lot of counterplay. Black could play like this, of course. It's not the end of the world. They have a pawn to show for the the uncomfortable position, but we have full compensation for the pawn, and we have an easier attacking game. So instead, after bishop to g5, what black often does in this position is they actually play the move pawn to h6. Now, one other option that they can go for is the move pawn to d6, and this was actually what Grishuk and Caruana did against Abdusattorov, and the game continued with f4. Now black played queen e7, and Abdusattorov, he continued with the move knight a3, which is absolutely fine to play knight a3, and I'll just show you the rough idea. After knight a3, black will develop their pieces, we strike at their knight here, and we kick the knight back, and then we just play this position. We can go f5 in some situations here, and we can play a position where we're down a pawn, but we have uncomfortable pressure against this knight. We can drive the knight from e3 to d5. If they castle queenside, we can launch an attack, and so we get this kind of fun, aggressive game. Now, having said that, in my opinion, if the opponent plays like this, I prefer to play the move pawn to f5. I think that's even better here, because now we take away the square of e6, and it's also really difficult for them to ever break this pin, because let's say they play h6, bishop h4, and they try to break the pin with g5. Now we would just take en passant, and after they take us back, now our rook is also in the game, so we could win a piece. So suddenly that pin is there for life, and it's going to be a bit uncomfortable. I actually played a game online against a roughly 2,200 rated player from this position, and I will just show it to you, not because either of us played very well, but because I think it's a good game that highlights the risk involved for black. I will show what they did. They went bishop to d7. I went knight to c3. I threatened knight d5. They stopped it with c6. I played king h1. And the idea with king h1 is in some situations you might find a queen here and you're kind of used to just tucking your king away. No checks from this knight ever. And also if I at some point want to push these pawns up the board, it's useful. I'm also waiting for black to decide, do you want to castle into this pin? And then maybe I'll run the pawns up the board. Or do you want to castle queenside and maybe I'll run these pawns up the board? Black didn't commit, went queen d8, so I started advancing on the queen side just in case they were going to castle that way. And after queen b6, I defended my pawn. After h6, I dropped the bishop back, moving away from one diagonal, but stepping into this other diagonal that I thought was useful. Now the knight on d4 is uncomfortable. Black castled, but as the highlights showed, the pawn on h6, having pushed it, is is a very dangerous point because in some cases I might have a sacrifice here. I think black was happy to castle because I no longer had my bishop able to damage their pawn structure that way. But I think this is a little bit risky. I went rook f3, a move I was happy about because our idea, or my idea, was to put the rook over to g3 or h3 and target. And they cannot take the rook because of the queen on b6 falling. So after rook to f3, black tried to move c5 to break this pin, but I don't think it was a good move at all because it gave me this big outpost on d5 that I was able to use to my advantage. So I went rook g3. My threat is bishop takes h6 because of the new pin. And so he stopped that with king h7. I put my knight on d5, targeted his queen and his knight. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now I'm pointing with the square. What I'm showing is that the knight was here before, but now the knight is no longer there, so I can maybe put my queen on h5 on that square very soon. Black tried to get rid of my strong bishop on d5, but I went queen h5, and whoops, sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. I went queen h5, that was a bit of a spoiler. Went queen h5, black went queen d8, and now I took on g7 with check, king takes, and crash through with bishop takes h6. So very typical kind of sacrificial ideas. But yeah, the position is completely lost. Let's say that you went king here, it would be queen g5 mate. And if you went here, it would be queen g4 and mate. Or if you want to even be a bit more fancy, you would have queen g6 because of the fact that the pawn is pinned. So the point is that very, very quickly, all of white's pieces, they just were managed to storm the king side. And this is the kind of dangerous situation that black can find themselves in against the Deutz Gambit. So this is after pawn to d6, f4. If black plays queen e7, my recommendation is this move, pawn to f5, and compensation by way of having the two bishops, having a more active position, having a safer king, and having this nasty pin of the knight on f6. If not this move, pawn to d6, what black will normally go for is pawn to h6. Now we drop the bishop back and we set a very nasty trap here. And the nasty trap arises after the move pawn to g5. This is the most common move that black can play at the non-professional level, and one of the reasons why the Deutz Gambit scores so well, that so many people are taking the bait and playing this move. And here, I can assure you, if you play this variation, I can assure you, it will not be so long before an opponent plays exactly this against you, g5, and you get to uncork a very, very nice move. But before we talk about this, let's talk about the final option that black has that is popular at the grandmaster level. And that is that black can go d6 here. We carry on with our plan of f4. And now they hit us with this move, bishop to g4. And we have to be prepared to play a simplified middle game from this position. And you might be thinking, what is a simplified middle game? Or maybe you know, I will tell you, a simplified middle game is a position without the queens on the board, but it's not an end game, but it's sort of in between, like a middle game position, or like this is, let's say, an opening position that is just about to arrive to the middle game very soon. And then you'll play your middle game, but as the middle game kind of inches closer towards that end game and the queens are off the board, that sometimes those positions are called simplified middle game. And you might be saying, how are we going to force a simplified middle game from this position? Well, you're about to find out. Basically, what happens is after bishop g4, incredibly, none of these squares are good for our queen. So why is that? Well, Queen e1 can be ruled out because of knight takes c2. Queen c1 can be ruled out because of bishop e2. Now our bishop is hanging, and if bishop takes, knight takes, and now we have a nasty fork again. And if we move our bishop, we lose our rook. So now we can rule out both e1 and c1. Queen d3 can be ruled out for the similar reason of bishop e2, hitting our queen and our rook. And the final difficult one to figure out is why to rule out queen to d2. Well, this one is really tricky, but the basic point is that by playing these moves, this bishop is undefended. So black has an idea that is really very beautiful, in my opinion. And that is that here they can play the very clever move, pawn to g5. And you might be thinking, what is going on with this move? The game gets wild. But here's the point. If we take this pawn, now with the connection of our bishop to the queen broken, black can actually play knight takes e4, targeting our queen and targeting our pawn. So when we move the queen back, black actually takes this pawn. And right now, black is up 2 pawns. And there's only one move here that we can play where we get back one of the pawns, and that is bishop takes f7. The point is, if knight takes f7, we're picking up the queen. But after king to d7, incredibly, I mean, this is actually very good for black. It seems strange that with your king on d7, you're going to be better. But the more I thought about this position, well, there's 2 pawns in the center of the board. The king is very safe. It can slot to c8. The knight is a beautiful piece. Black has direct threats, and in the future, you never know. Maybe it's our king that's going to be in trouble with all of these pieces crashing down, and potentially the rook, potentially the queen. And you can see that in the end, the tables have turned, right? We are down a pawn, but not in the way that we wanted. So this is a line that is very tricky, but very important to avoid as white. And that is why I have shown it. So the question becomes, why are we going if we can't go queen d2 and we can't move the queen anywhere else, what can we do? And the answer is we only have one option, and that is to take this knight on f6. So the knight on f6 was protecting the bishop on g4, and this leads to a forced sequence for both sides that takes us to this simplified middle game. So what happens is after bishop takes f6, black takes our queen. Now we take their queen, they take our bishop, we take their bishop, they take this pawn on c2, looking to grab the rook on a1. We have to continue our development and defend our rook. And they take the rook, we take the rook, and they take that hanging pawn on f4. Now we're down 3 pawns and a rook for just 2 minor pieces. And that's usually a bad situation. So we play knight d5 to get back one of our pawns. Black plays the move castle, which actually forces us to take this pawn instead of this one, because we'd like to take this one to damage the pawn structure. But the problem is black goes rook to c8, winning either our knight or our bishop. So important to avoid that. So we take on f4. And this position, you can mess around with it at home if you want. I've played it myself a few times, and I've had okay results with it online. And overall, I looked at the database, and in general, white holds their own. The computers say it's about equal. So it's a very playable position. It's not a big advantage, but you're only ever going to get this position when your opponents know exactly what they're doing and they've studied the theory. And that only tends to happen at the intermediate or above level. So, and anyway, even if they do, this position has a lot of life. So you can still play for a win from here. Now, let's go back and let's talk about where that all came from. It came from this move pawn to d6, f4, and now bishop to g4. But what happens when, instead of all of this, black doesn't play the best chess? That's what we've been focusing on, but instead plays the most common move, which is pawn to g5. How can we take advantage of this move? Well, it's very important to remember, never drop your bishop back. Because if you drop your bishop back, pawn goes to d6, everything is very solid for black, you're down a clean pawn, and honestly, you have nothing to show for it. So we need to avoid this. So what can we do? And this is why I think so many black players play this. The trap is very subtle. We play a brilliant move, and that is pawn to f4. We ignore our bishop completely. And the point is that if black captures our bishop, we go pawn takes e5, suddenly their knight is hit, and their other knight on f6 is also hit. So no matter what they do, they're going to end up giving back their extra piece. In fact, black sometimes does play like this, and they need to find only one move to not be in a losing position. And that is the difficult to find move, pawn to d5. If they do this, we take their knight, they take our bishop, we take their queen, they take our queen, and we take their knight with our pawn, I like to do, so that we undouble our pawns. And the position, if you now do a pawn count, we have 7 pawns and they have 7 pawns. But their pawn structure is a bit worse than ours, in my opinion. And their king is a little bit not ideal here on d8, because we can bring a rook and give a check at the right moment. I think our knight is also going to be quite a good piece. Maybe knight d2 to hit the pawn, knight c3 to go to d5, maybe knight d2, knight f3 to pick up this pawn at the right moment. So we have a lot of ideas. And although objectively the position is only a small advantage for white, I think it's easier to play. So this is one of the situations you might find yourself in. But what are the other paths after bishop h4 and after g5 and f4? Well, we looked at pawn takes bishop here with g takes h4. But what would happen if black plays g takes f4? Well, this is really where our gambit, our Deutz Gambit, starts to shine, because we get the gambit again. So at this point, we've gambited a pawn, we've gambited another pawn on f4, we offered the bishop, and now we crash through our rook on f4. And this is just, I love this. I've played this position. I've had this position on the board online in multiple games, and I love it every time when I catch an opponent out with this line. It's just such a nice one. The point is, the bishop and the rook are putting too much pressure on the knight, and the only way to release that pressure is to take the rook. But now we go queen takes knight, and now we have huge pressure on this knight on f6, and there's no way for black to get out of this. So yeah, I mean, you can try anything that you want as black, but simply the knight is falling. If you move the knight, you lose everything. Let's say that they move the knight, you can even take this rook with checkmate. That's how horrific the situation is for black on the dark squares. And on top of that, we're not even threatening to just win a piece, but we would win a piece with an attack on the queen and the rook. And the queen currently doesn't even have an escape square. Probably the best move for black is something like c5. But here we can drop the queen back and pick up the knight on the next move. Or we can even do something like queen e5 check, queen e7, take, and now e5. Just to pick up the knight with check on the next move, and the position is completely losing for black. So after g5, f4, we know that if black takes our bishop, then after we take their pawn, the best move they have is d5, the only way to stay alive. And there we get a small advantage. The question is, and we know that if black plays pawn takes f4, rook takes f4, we win on the spot. If black takes this way, then we take the knight, and after they take our bishop, we take with the rook, and we also win on the spot because the knight is falling. This time it's not pinned this way, but it's pinned the other way. So I was going to say it's a nightmare, but there was no, really, truly no pun intended. So f4, the position is very bad here against no matter almost anything that black does. But I'd be lying to you if I said, okay, play f4, get up off your chair and grab a coffee and wait for your opponent to resign. That's not the truth. The truth of this position. Black does have one move that more or less keeps them in the game, and that is the move d5. But the good news is that's really difficult to find and will rarely be played against you unless your opponent knows this line. But if they know this line, they usually won't play g5. So it's kind of a great situation that most of the time, if your opponent falls for the trap, they don't know the antidote to the trap. So d5. Against this, we take the pawn, and the point is now after pawn takes bishop, in this situation, pawn takes pawn, we still recover our piece, but after knight takes d5, queen takes d4, they manage to, what we say, consolidate, meaning that after the bishop goes to e6, their knight is now safe on d5, their pawn on f7 is safe, their rook is safe, and that's kind of the idea behind this clever d5 move. It just shuts enough lines down and gives enough time for black to just fix their development so that they're not in terrible trouble. I will say one more thing about this position, and that is that if we play, some slow move, black's threat is knight to b6, which would force the queens off the board because the bishop is attacked twice, and our queen is also attacked. And in general, we don't want this. We don't want a situation where the queens come off the board, because now their king in the center of the board will be very happy without the queens. And in fact, black, if anything, black is probably a little bit better here because it's us that are lagging behind in development. So I just show you that so that you know the one thing to avoid. What I would recommend instead, if you ever get this position, is to drop the queen to f2 to avoid any queen exchanges and to put some pressure here on the pawn on f7. Now, for example, if they tried knight b6, they would just lose on the spot because we would take here, pawn takes, and queen f7 would be checkmate. So, of course, I don't think you're going to get exactly this, but you can get a position like this, which is, according to modern engines, according to, I always, whenever I analyze anything, I always like to put it through one of the strongest computer that I can get my hands on. And according to this computer, it says white is a little bit better, but nothing much, like a third of a pawn in computer terms. But you still have a position. And just to share with you what the idea that the computer likes to do is, let's say that black does something like try and keep this knight solid. Oftentimes what the computer was liking to do is to, at the right moment, play h3 and lock this pawn down on h4, and then bring this knight over to f3, or the knight via d2 to e4, and get onto these squares with the queen also eyeing up a7, which is relevant in case black ever castles. I can't really discuss this position further because there's 15 different plans available to both sides at every turn, and it's just we wouldn't have the time. But hopefully it gives you a little bit of a flavor as to what you might get if your opponent plays near perfectly. But most of the time, as I say, your opponent won't do that, and after f4 they'll either take the bishop here, and after pawn takes they won't find the move d5 and they'll collapse, the position will just break down, or they will take here, and that's the cleanest win. You just pick up this rook on f1, you smash rook takes f4, and it's game over. It's a lovely trap, pawn takes and queen takes, and a total collapse on the dark square. So that's been the Deutz Gambit. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you weren't familiar with it, then I wish you the best of luck as you start playing this. And I'm always interested to see how your results actually are. Do you get this exact trap against your opponent? Please let me know. And if you've liked this video, as always, dropping a like helps me out for the visibility of the videos. And I'll be continuing this win with 1e4 series, and I'll be talking about more e4, e5 positions in the next video. So if you like that and you haven't subscribed yet, you may wish to consider doing so now. In any case, hope to see you around in another video, and yeah, I'll see you soon.